My grandparents' 50th anniversary was a perfect celebration of love. Then, a dropped photo revealed a secret affair that had lasted for decades, shattering everything. The air shimmered with the golden glow of late afternoon sun, filtering through the ancient oak trees that framed my grandparents' sprawling backyard. It was their 50th wedding anniversary, a golden jubilee, and the entire family had gathered to celebrate half a century of what we all believed was unwavering love. My grandmother, Eleanor, looked radiant in a cream-colored lace dress, her silver hair styled in soft waves, her eyes sparkling with a joy that seemed to defy her 82 years. My grandfather, Arthur, stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her back, his smile warm and genuine. He was 85, his movements a little slower, his voice a little softer, but his devotion to Eleanor was, to all of us, as solid and enduring as the oak trees themselves. They were the bedrock of our family, the living embodiment of happily ever after. Every toast, every shared memory, every heartfelt hug reinforced the narrative. Theirs was a perfect, unbreakable bond. The party was a whirlwind of laughter, reminiscing, and the clinking of champagne glasses. Cousins I hadn't seen in years embraced, children chased each other across the manicured lawn, and the scent of grilled food mingled with the sweet fragrance of my grandmother's prize-winning roses. As the designated family photographer, I moved through the crowd, capturing candid moments, the genuine affection that flowed between generations. I snapped pictures of my parents dancing, my aunts and uncles sharing old jokes, and countless shots of Eleanor and Arthur, their faces etched with the lines of a life well lived, a life lived, as far as I knew, entirely together, later in the evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, purple shadows, my grandmother excused herself to freshen up. She left her small, ornate clutch bag on a garden bench, a delicate, beaded accessory she rarely used. A few minutes later, my younger cousin, Leo, a boisterous 7-year-old, tripped over the bench while playing tag. The clutch tumbled to the ground, its contents spilling out onto the grass. Among the usual items, a compact mirror, a tube of lipstick, a neatly folded tissue, there was a small, tarnished silver locket. It looked old, almost antique, and felt out of place among her meticulously organized belongings. My grandmother was not one for sentimental trinkets. Her jewelry was always elegant, never ostentatious. Curiosity, that quiet, insistent voice we all possess, nudged me. I picked up the locket, its surface cool against my fingertips. It was heavier than it looked, and the silver was worn smooth in places, as if it had been handled countless times. I pressed the small clasp, and it sprang open with a soft click. Inside, there were 2 tiny, faded photographs. One was of my grandmother, Eleanor, in her youth, her hair dark and her eyes bright with a youthful exuberance I had only ever seen in old wedding photos. But the other photograph was of a man I didn't recognize. He was young, handsome, with a mischievous smile and eyes that held a striking resemblance to my grandfather, yet he was undeniably not Arthur. His hair was darker, his jawline slightly different, and there was a certain wildness in his gaze that my grandfather, even in his youth, had never possessed. A cold not formed in my stomach. Who is this man? Why did my grandmother carry his photograph in a locket, hidden away in a clutch she rarely used? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. This wasn't a family friend. This wasn't a distant relative. The way her youthful self smiled at him from the locket, the tender, almost intimate quality of his gaze, this was something else entirely. This was a secret, a profound, deeply personal secret that had no place in the idyllic narrative of Eleanor and Arthur's golden anniversary. My grandmother returned then, her face refreshed, her smile still bright. She saw me holding the locket, her eyes falling on the open clasp, and the color drained from her face. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated dread. Her hand flew to her mouth, a silent gasp. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a fragile whisper that held a lifetime of fear. "What have you found?" I didn't answer. I just held up the locket, my hand shaking violently. Her eyes, usually so kind and warm, filled with a look of profound terror. She sank onto the bench beside me, her posture suddenly frail and old, as if the weight of a 60-year-old secret had just come crashing down on her. "Who is this man, Grandma?" I asked, my voice cold and hard, a stranger's voice. "Why do you have his picture? And why is it hidden?" She didn't deny it. Instead, She broke down, the quiet, silent tears of a woman who had been living a lie for decades. Her shoulders shook with a silent, profound grief that felt far older than her years. "It was a long time ago, Sarah," she finally managed to say between sobs, her voice raw with a pain I had never heard before. "Before your grandfather and I were married. His name was Thomas. He was my first love. My true love." She told me a story that shattered every preconceived notion I had about her life, about their marriage. She and Thomas had met in college, a whirlwind romance filled with passion and dreams of a future together. They were inseparable, planning to marry as soon as they graduated. But her family, a prominent and influential one, disapproved of Thomas. He was from a working-class background, without the social standing or financial prospects they deemed suitable for their daughter. They forbade the marriage, threatening to disinherit Eleanor if she defied them. My grandfather, Arthur, was then introduced to her, a man from a respectable, well-to-do family, a suitable match. "I tried to fight it, Sarah," she confessed, her voice thick with regret. "I tried to run away with Thomas. But my family, they were powerful. They found us. They threatened Thomas, threatened to ruin his life, his family. I had no choice. I had to let him go. I had to marry Arthur." It was a different time, Amelia. A woman didn't just walk away from her life, from her family's expectations. "So I married Arthur. And I buried my heart." She spoke of a profound, silent sacrifice. She had married my grandfather, a man she respected and grew to care for deeply, but her heart had always belonged to another. "It's been our secret for over 60 years, she confessed, her voice filled with a lifetime of guilt. "Arthur and I, we built a life, a family. We were happy in our own way. But the ghost of Thomas has always been between us. I never spoke of him. It was a condition of my marriage. But I never forgot him. I saved that locket. I kept a part of my life hidden away, a life I lost. The betrayal was twofold. My grandmother's secret love, her lifelong devotion to another man, was one thing. But my grandfather's unknowing complicity, his living a life with a woman whose heart was forever tied to another, was another. She had lived a lie, building a family on a foundation of a broken heart and a lost love." As she spoke, the reality of it all was overwhelming. My perfect family, a symbol of unwavering love, was just a myth, a beautiful lie. "Your grandfather, he deserves to live out the rest of his days in peace, Sarah," she pleaded, her eyes welling up again. "His heart is not as strong as it used to be. This would destroy him. It would kill him to know that I never truly loved him the way he loved me. Please, promise me you won't tell him. Let him live out the rest of his days in peace, in the world he's created for himself." She was asking me to become a conspirator, to participate in the very lie that had defined their lives. I held the locket in my hands, a tangible piece of proof that my entire family's history was not what it seemed. The face in the locket, Thomas, was not just a face. It was a ghost, a secret that had been buried in a hidden locket for over half a century. And now I was being asked to bury it all over again. The choice was a moral one, a choice between honoring my grandmother's pain and respecting my grandfather's right to the truth. The weight of that choice was unbearable, a burden I was completely unprepared to carry. The house, once a sanctuary of love and family, now felt like a mausoleum of two lives that had lived parallel, separate lives for far too long. The final chapter of their life, it seemed, was not a peaceful sunset, but a final, devastating storm. The silence that had once haunted me now felt like a secret I was being forced to keep. The tarnished silver locket felt impossibly heavy in my palm, a cold, metallic testament to a truth I wished I could unknow. My grandmother's tearful confession, a raw, desperate whisper of a love lost and a life chosen out of duty, echoed in the quiet garden. Her plea, "Please, promise me you won't tell him," was a heavy weight on my conscience, a silent burden that threatened to crush the very foundation of my family. My perfect, loving grandmother, the woman who had nurtured me with apple pies and gentle stories, was asking me to become a conspirator, to participate in the very lie that had defined their lives. My grandfather, Arthur, the man she had married, the man who believed he had her unwavering love, was now a potential victim of a deception that had spanned 6 decades. The irony of it all was a bitter taste in my mouth, a flavor of betrayal and profound sadness. I stood in the golden glow of their anniversary party, surrounded by laughter and celebration, yet feeling utterly alone with a secret that belonged to another lifetime. I didn't give my grandmother an answer. I couldn't. I simply closed the locket, its soft click of final, irrevocable sound, and tucked it away in my pocket. I couldn't trust myself to destroy it, and I couldn't trust her not to try and do it herself. The locket, once hidden in a delicate clutch, was now hidden on my person, a burden I was forced to carry alone. The act felt like a silent rebellion, a decision to honor the truth, no matter how painful, over the comfort of a lie. The party continued around us, a vibrant, oblivious tableau of familial bliss, while my own world had just been irrevocably shattered. That night, sleep was a foreign concept. My mind raced with questions about Thomas. The locket, a small, tangible piece of a forgotten past, seemed to hum with unspoken stories. I sat up in my bed, the quiet hum of the night a backdrop to the frantic beating of my own heart. I pulled out the locket again, its surface cool against my fingertips. I stared at the faded photograph of Thomas, his mischievous smile, his wild eyes. Who was this man who had captured my grandmother's heart so completely, so enduringly? What had become of him? Had he lived a life of quiet longing, just as she had, my grandmother's confession, while heartbreaking, felt incomplete? There was a profound sadness in her eyes that went beyond a lost love. There was a depth to her grief that hinted at a more complex story, a secret perhaps even she didn't fully grasp. The way she had aged, the quiet resignation in her movements, the subtle shift in her demeanor over the years, it all suddenly made a terrible, gut-wrenching kind of sense. The perfect life she had built with Arthur was not just a compromise, it was a carefully constructed facade, a prison of her own making. The next morning, the house was quiet, still holding the lingering scent of celebration and the faint echo of laughter. My grandparents were still asleep, their bedroom door closed, a symbol of the secrets that now lay between them and between me and my grandmother. I knew I had to find out more about Thomas. The locket was my only lead, a fragile thread connecting me to a past that was begging to be unraveled. I remembered my grandmother mentioning that Thomas had been from a working-class background and that her family had threatened to ruin his life, his family. This suggested he wasn't just a fleeting college romance. He had a family, a life that could be affected. My search began quietly, meticulously. I couldn't risk exposing anything to my parents or aunts. They were too deeply invested in the myth of Arthur and Eleanor's perfect love story. I started with old college yearbooks, searching for Thomas's name in the years my grandmother would have attended. The college library was a dusty, quiet place, filled with the ghosts of forgotten youth. I found her yearbook, her youthful face smiling out from the pages, a stark contrast to the weary woman I knew. And then I found him. Thomas Miller. His picture was there, a handsome young man with that same mischievous smile, his eyes burning with a youthful intensity. Beneath his photo, a small blurb listed his major, his clubs, and his hometown, a small, industrial town called Blackwood, a few hours' drive away. A cold not formed in my stomach. Blackwood. It was a place known for its old factories, a place that had seen better days. It was exactly the kind of working-class background my grandmother's family would have disapproved of. The pieces were beginning to fit, but the picture they formed was far uglier than I could have ever imagined. My grandmother's family hadn't just threatened Thomas, they had likely followed through on those threats, ensuring you would never be a threat to their daughter's suitable marriage. I decided to go to Blackwood. I lied to my parents about a weekend trip with friends, an easy excuse for a college student. The drive was long, the landscape slowly transforming from manicured suburbs to gritty industrial towns. Blackwood was exactly as I imagined, old brick buildings, faded storefronts, and a sense of quiet resignation in the air. I found the local historical society, a small, unassuming building filled with dusty archives and the scent of old paper. I asked for records related to the Miller family, specifically Thomas Miller, who would now be in his early 80s. The archivist, a kind, elderly woman with spectacles perched on her nose, was surprisingly helpful. She pulled out old town directories, newspaper clippings, and even some family genealogies. I found Thomas Miller. He had indeed lived in Blackwood his entire life. He had worked in the local steel mill, just as his father had. He had married, had children, and had passed away peacefully in his sleep just 5 years ago. My heart ached for my grandmother. Thomas had lived a full life, a life she had been denied, but then a new, unsettling discovery emerged, a twist so cruel and so devastating it would rewrite the entire story. Among the newspaper clippings, I found an obituary for Thomas Miller. It listed his wife, his children, and then a small, almost imperceptible detail that sent a jolt of ice through my veins. It mentioned a son, born out of wedlock, given up for adoption in his youth. The name of the son was not listed, but the date of birth was. It was the same year my grandmother and Thomas would have been in college, the same year she had spoken of their passionate, reckless love. And the adoption agency listed was one known for discreet, closed adoptions, often arranged by wealthy families. My mind reeled. My grandmother had told me she had to let Thomas go, that her family had threatened him. But what if there was more to it? What if their love had produced a child that my grandmother's powerful family had forced them to give up? The thought was a chilling possibility, a layer of tragedy so profound it dwarfed the secret affair I had initially uncovered. My grandmother's profound sadness, the way she had aged beyond her years, the quiet resignation in her eyes, it all suddenly made a terrible, gut-wrenching kind of sense. She hadn't just lost a love, she had lost a child. And my grandfather, Arthur, the man she had married, had been living with a woman who had carried this devastating secret for 60 years. He had married a woman who had given up a child who was the living, breathing testament to a love that was not his own. The betrayal was so much deeper, so much more profound than I could have ever imagined. My grandmother's secret wasn't just about a lost love, it was about a lost child, a child she had been forced to give up. And my grandfather, Arthur, had been living with a woman who carried this secret, a woman whose heart was forever tied to another, and whose past held a profound, unspoken tragedy. The perfect family I had always believed in was just a myth, a beautiful lie built on a foundation of unspoken pain and lost lives. And now I was holding the proof of it all in my hands. The weight of that knowledge was unbearable, a burden I was completely unprepared to carry. The silence that had once haunted me now felt like a secret I was being forced to keep. The final chapter of their life, it seemed, was not a peaceful sunset, but a final, devastating storm. The house, once a sanctuary of love and family, now felt like a mausoleum of two lives that had lived parallel, separate lives for far too long. The faded obituary, clutched in my trembling hand, was a cruel twist of fate. My grandmother's lost love, Thomas, had a son given up for adoption. The perfect life I knew was a myth, built on a child's unspoken tragedy. The small, quiet historical society in Blackwood felt like the epicenter of a seismic shift in my understanding of my family. The word son, buried in the faded ink of Thomas Miller's obituary, resonated with a chilling finality. My grandmother, Eleanor, hadn't just lost a love, she had, in all likelihood, lost a child. This wasn't merely a secret affair from her youth, it was a profound, lifelong tragedy, a sacrifice forced upon her by the rigid societal expectations of her time and the ruthless control of her family. The perfect golden anniversary, the symbol of unwavering love, now felt like a grotesque masquerade, built on the silent suffering of a mother and the erased existence of a child. The tears I had shed for her lost love now felt insufficient, a shallow understanding of the ocean of grief she must have carried for 60 years. The drive back to my grandparents' house was a blur of highway and unspoken questions. The world outside the car window seemed to mock my internal turmoil, its normalcy a stark contrast to the shattered reality within me. How could she have lived with this? How could she have smiled, laughed, raised a family, all while carrying the unspeakable pain of a lost child? And my grandfather, Arthur, the man who had married her, had he known? Was his unwavering love a testament to his ignorance, or to a chilling complicity in a secret that ran deeper than I could have ever imagined? The locket, once a symbol of her hidden romantic past, now felt like a tombstone for a life that never was. I found my grandmother in the sunroom, her tablet glowing faintly, illuminating a face etched with a profound loneliness I now understood with a gut-wrenching clarity. She looked up as I entered, her eyes, usually so kind, now filled with a familiar flicker of fear. She saw the grim set of my jaw, the way my hands trembled as I placed the crumpled obituary on the small table between us. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, punctuated only by the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a fragile sound that held a lifetime of unspoken pain. "What have you found now?" I didn't answer with words. I simply pointed to the line in the obituary, the one that spoke of a son, born out of wedlock, given up for adoption. Her eyes, usually so guarded, widened with a raw, primal terror. The color drained from her face, leaving it a ghostly white. The tablet slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor, its screen going dark, a final, symbolic end to her secret digital world. She didn't deny it. Instead, she broke down, the quiet, silent tears of a woman who had been living with an unbearable truth for decades. Her shoulders shook with a profound, guttural sorrow that spoke of a lifetime of suppressed grief. His name was David, she sobbed, her voice raw with a pain I had never heard before, a pain that transcended the simple grief of a lost love. My son. Our son. Thomas and mine. She recounted the story, her voice a slow, halting chronicle of a life I had never known. After her family discovered her affair with Thomas, the threats had escalated. They had discovered her pregnancy, a devastating blow to their reputation. They had given her an ultimatum: marry Arthur, the suitable match, or be disinherited and watch Thomas's life be utterly destroyed. But the child was the ultimate leverage. They had arranged for a discreet adoption through a private agency, ensuring no record would ever trace back to their prominent family. They had forced her to give up her son, her own flesh and blood, a sacrifice she had carried in silence for 60 years. I held him, Sarah, she whispered, her voice cracking, just for a few moments. He was so tiny, so perfect. I promised him I would never forget him. I promised him I would find him one day. But my family, they made sure I couldn't. They moved me away. They monitored my letters, my calls. They made sure I married Arthur and that I built a new life, a perfect life, a life that had no room for the child I had lost. The betrayal was so much deeper, so much more profound than I could have ever imagined. My grandmother hadn't just been forced to give up a love, she had been forced to give up a child. Her perfect marriage to Arthur was not just a compromise, it was a gilded cage, a prison built on the grave of her own son. Her quiet grief, her reclusiveness, her sudden interest in a secret digital life, it all made a terrible, gut-wrenching kind of sense. She was a woman who had been starved of connection, starved of the very essence of motherhood, and she had sought solace in a world where she could finally be seen, finally be loved, even if it was a secret love. The infidelity with Leo was not an act of malice, it was an act of profound loneliness, a desperate attempt to fill a void left by a lifetime of unspoken grief. And Arthur? I asked, my voice trembling. Did Grandpa know? Did he know about David? Her eyes, filled with a new, raw honesty, met mine. He knew, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Not at first. Not about the child. But he knew about Thomas. He knew I didn't love him the way he loved me. He knew I was heartbroken. And then, years later, after we were married, after your father was born, he found a letter. A letter from Clara, from Thomas's family. It was a letter about David. About his adoption. Arthur, he confronted me. He was devastated. He was furious. He felt betrayed. But he didn't leave me. He couldn't. His family, they had their own expectations. Their own reputation to protect. So, he made me a bargain. My heart hammered against my ribs. A bargain. Another one. The perfect marriage was a series of transactions, a web of secrets and compromises. He told me he would keep my secret, she continued, her voice filled with a desperate weariness, as long as I promised him that our life, our family, our reputation, and our wealth would always remain with us. He said he would never speak of it, never acknowledge it. But he also said he would never truly forgive me. He said he would never truly forget. He lived with it, Sarah. He lived with it for 60 years. He built a perfect life, a perfect family, but he built it on a foundation of a broken heart and a profound, unspoken betrayal. He was a good man, Sarah, in his own way. But he was a man who lived with a wound that never healed. The revelation was a gut punch. My grandfather, Arthur, wasn't just an unknowing victim, he was a silent participant in a decades-long lie. He had known about David, about the child his wife had given up, and he had chosen to live with that knowledge, to make a bargain that protected his own reputation and his family's legacy. His quiet demeanor, his occasional moments of distant sadness, they weren't just the signs of aging, they were the manifestations of a man who had lived with a profound, unspoken wound for 60 years. He had loved my grandmother, yes, but it was a love built on a foundation of unspoken grief and a shared, terrible secret, the the story had taken a new and devastating turn. My grandmother's infidelity was just a small piece of a much larger, more tragic puzzle. The true story of their marriage was one of two people, both deeply flawed, both profoundly human, who had made a series of heartbreaking choices to survive in a world that demanded perfection. The house, once a sanctuary of love and family, now felt like a mausoleum of two lives that had lived parallel, separate lives for far too long. The final chapter of their life, it seemed, was not a peaceful sunset, but a final, devastating storm. The silence that had once haunted me now felt like a secret I was being forced to keep. The burden of this new truth, the weight of a lost child and a decades-long betrayal, was almost unbearable, a weight I was completely unprepared to carry. My perfect family, a myth I had cherished for a lifetime, was gone. All that remained was a secret, a heavy silence, and a burden I was completely unprepared to carry. The house, once a symbol of perfect love, was now a museum of a life built on a foundation of betrayal and quiet desperation. My grandmother's confession of a lost child and a lifelong bargain shattered the last vestiges of my family's perfect facade. Now, the weight of their combined secrets became my unbearable burden. The sun had long set on the golden anniversary party, but the darkness that enveloped our family was far more profound than the absence of light. My grandmother, Eleanor, sat before me, her face a ravaged landscape of grief and decades of unspoken pain. Her confession of a son, David, forced into adoption, and of a lifetime bargain with my grandfather, Arthur, to protect their reputation and wealth was a final, devastating blow. The locket, once a simple symbol of a lost love, now felt like a tombstone for a life that never was, a child erased from history. The perfect love story I had always cherished was not just a myth, it was a carefully constructed prison, built on the silent suffering of a mother and the chilling complicity of a husband. The tears I shed were no longer just for her, or for Thomas, but for David, the ghost child, and for the profound, systemic cruelty that had defined their lives. The house, once a sanctuary of love and family, now felt like a mausoleum of two lives that had lived parallel, separate existences for far too long. The laughter and clinking glasses of the anniversary party seemed like a distant, mocking echo. My grandmother's grief, once so distant and unsettling, now made a terrifying kind of sense. Her emotional affair with Leo, her desperate search for connection in a secret digital life, was not a sudden, late-life betrayal. It was a desperate act of a woman who had felt emotionally and maternally abandoned for decades. The discovery of my grandfather's complicity, his quiet acceptance of this unspeakable secret for the sake of social standing, was the final, devastating piece of a puzzle I never wanted to solve. I spent the next few days in a daze. The weight of this new, combined truth a constant, suffocating presence. How could I live with this knowledge? How could I look at my father, my aunts, my cousins, knowing the foundation of their lives was built on such a profound lie? The family, still basking in the afterglow of the anniversary, remained oblivious. They spoke of Arthur and Eleanor's enduring love, of their unwavering commitment, and each word felt like a fresh wound. I was trapped, torn between honoring my grandmother's desperate plea for silence and the undeniable moral imperative to acknowledge David's existence, to somehow, in some way, bring justice to a life that had been so cruelly erased. The ticking clock on my grandfather's health grew louder. His dementia, which had been a slow, creeping fog, seemed to accelerate in the days following the anniversary. His periods of lucidity became rarer, his voice a ghost of the booming laugh I remembered. The doctor advised us that it was time to consider hospice care, a final step toward an inevitable conclusion. This created a new, desperate urgency within me. If I was ever to find David, if I was ever to bring any semblance of peace or closure to this decades-long tragedy, I had to act now, before it was too late. My search for David became a quiet obsession, a mission I undertook alone in the dead of night. I couldn't risk exposing anything to my parents or aunts. They were too deeply invested in the myth of Arthur and Eleanor's perfect love story. I revisited the Historical Society in Blackwood, poring over adoption records from the specified period, searching for any mention of a child born to Clara or adopted from the agency my grandmother's family had used. The records were sparse, often deliberately vague, a testament to the lengths wealthy families went to bury their secrets. It was a frustrating, heartbreaking process, a constant reminder of the systemic injustice that had defined David's life. Then, a new clue emerged from the most unlikely of places. While helping my grandmother clean out her old photo albums, a task she undertook with a strange, detached determination, I found a small, neatly folded piece of paper tucked behind a picture of my father as a child. It was a faded, yellowed receipt from a private investigator, dated from almost 30 years ago. The name on the receipt was Arthur Henderson, my grandfather. And the description of services rendered was chillingly vague, locating and discreetly monitoring subject. Beneath it, a handwritten note in my grandfather's elegant cursive, David Miller, Willow Creek. My heart stopped. My grandfather hadn't just known about David, he had actively sought him out. He had monitored his life, perhaps from a distance, a silent, unseen presence in the life of the son his wife had been forced to give up. This wasn't just complicity, it was a profound, heartbreaking obsession. He had lived with this knowledge, carrying the burden of a secret child, while my grandmother believed he was merely emotionally distant. The perfect marriage was not just a lie, it was a complex, interlocking web of secrets, each spouse carrying their own, unaware of the other's profound hidden pain. The discovery of the private investigator's receipt and the address in Willow Creek was the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle. I had to go to Willow Creek. I lied to my parents about a school project, a flimsy excuse for a college student, and drove to the quiet, tree-lined suburb. The neighborhood was filled with small, well-maintained bungalows, a stark contrast to the sprawling Victorian that held so many secrets. I found the address, a modest house with a neatly tended garden. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the silence of the street. This was it. This was David's home. As I approached the front door, a man stepped out. He was in his early 60s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He looked eerily familiar, a ghost of a face I had seen only in faded photographs. He had my grandmother's eyes, but there was a certain quiet strength in his gaze that reminded me of Thomas. He looked at me, a young woman he had never seen before, with a polite, questioning expression. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. I'm Sarah," I began, my voice shaking. I'm Robert and Eleanor Henderson's granddaughter." His eyes widened, a flicker of recognition, then a profound sadness crossing his face. He knew. He knew who I was, or at least who my family was. The connection was undeniable. The ghost of my grandmother's past, the child she was forced to give up, was standing right in front of me, a living, breathing testament to a life of lies and unspoken tragedies. Just then, my phone rang. It was my father, his voice strained and urgent. "Sarah, you need to come home. It's Grandpa. He's asking for you. He's having a moment of clarity. He's asking for David." My blood ran cold. David. My grandfather, in his final moments of lucidity, was asking for the son he had known about, the son he had secretly monitored, the son his wife had been forced to give up. The two worlds, kept separate for 60 years, were about to collide. I looked at the man on the porch, the ghost of a child, now a living, breathing presence. The perfect family I had always known was gone, replaced by a tangled web of lies and secrets, and I was about to become the reluctant bridge between two lives, two families, and two profoundly painful truths. The house, once a sanctuary of love and family, now felt like the final battlefield of a man's life, a place where a family's legacy, built on a lie, was about to be either saved or destroyed by a man's desperate, final act of atonement. My family's fate was now in my hands, a burden I was completely unprepared to carry. The perfect family I had always known was a fiction, but the very real, very messy family I had just discovered was now my responsibility. My grandfather's final, whispered request to see David, the son he had secretly monitored for decades, shattered the last vestiges of our family's perfect facade. The truth was finally out, demanding its due. The phone call from my father, urgent and strained, felt like a siren in the quiet afternoon. "Sarah, you need to come home. It's Grandpa. He's asking for you. He's having a moment of clarity. He's asking for David." The name, uttered in his final, fading lucidity, was a thunderclap in the silence that had defined our family for 60 years. I looked at the man on the porch, David, the ghost child, now a living, breathing presence. His eyes, so much like my grandmother's, but with a quiet strength that reminded me of Thomas, held a profound sadness and a hesitant curiosity. The two worlds, kept separate by layers of secrets and societal expectations, were about to collide in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. The perfect family I had always known was gone, replaced by a tangled web of lies and unspoken tragedies, and I was about to become the reluctant bridge between two lives, two families, and two profoundly painful truths. I brought David into the house, my hand resting gently on his arm, a silent plea for understanding. My father, Margaret, and Susan stood in the hallway, their faces a canvas of shock and disbelief. They didn't need a formal introduction. David's resemblance to my grandmother and the subtle echoes of Thomas were undeniable. My grandmother, Eleanor, appeared from the sunroom, drawn by the sudden commotion. Her eyes, usually so guarded, widened with a raw, primal terror when she saw David. The 60 years of careful composure crumbled, leaving her a frail, trembling woman. Her hand flew to her mouth, a silent gasp of a secret finally exposed. "Mom," my father's voice was a shaky whisper. "Who is this?" Eleanor sank into a nearby chair, her head in her hands, her silence a profound confession. I knew I had to speak. I had to be the bridge. I laid out the entire story, from the hidden locket and my grandmother's secret affair with Leo, to the devastating discovery of David's adoption, and finally, to my grandfather's lifelong complicity and his desperate, final request. I spoke of Thomas, of the societal pressures that had forced my grandmother to give up her son, and of Arthur's quiet acceptance of this unspeakable secret for the sake of reputation and legacy. I explained how both of them, in their own ways, had lived parallel lives, each carrying a profound, unspoken wound. The reactions were a mix of anger, grief, and a devastating sense of betrayal. My aunts were furious, their perfect childhoods now tainted by a lie. How could he? Margaret cried, her face streaked with tears. How could he do this to us? To Mom? Our whole life, our whole family, was a lie. John, my father, was a man broken. He looked at my grandmother, his eyes filled with a new kind of pain. "You knew, Mom? All these years? You knew he was living with this, and you said nothing." My grandmother, Eleanor, finally raised her head. "It wasn't that simple," she said, her voice a weary admission of guilt. "I was a woman who was living with a lie. I was living with the ghost of a betrayal I had never fully understood. My heart was broken. I felt alone. And then I met Leo. He made me feel seen. He made me feel heard. He made me feel like I was alive again. The betrayal was not an act of malice. It was an act of profound loneliness and heartbreak. And Arthur, he was a good man in his own way. But he was a man who lived with a wound that never healed." Just then, the hospice nurse appeared in the doorway of my grandfather's bedroom, her face grim. "He's asking for someone," she said quietly. "He's having a moment of clarity. He's asking for David." The room was filled with a stunned silence. My father, with a grim determination, led David to his bedroom. My aunts followed, hesitant and unsure. I went with them. The room smelled of antiseptic and old age. My grandfather lay in bed, his eyes, so often lost in a fog, were now clear and focused. He looked at David, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "David," he whispered, his voice thin and fragile. "You came." David took his father's hand, a hand he had only just met. "I did, Dad. I came. I'm here." My grandfather's eyes looked at each of us, his two families, gathered around his deathbed. He looked at my grandmother, Eleanor, his gaze filled with a lifetime of shared secrets and unspoken understanding. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice filled with a profound gratitude and apology. You were my rock. You kept us all safe. Thank you." Then his gaze found David again. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice catching. "I loved you. I tried to be a good man, but I was just a man." He closed his eyes then, and with a final, shuddering breath, he was gone. The funeral was a somber affair, but it was different this time. David, now a known member of our family, was there, his presence a quiet testament to the truth. The inheritance discussions were complicated, but the family, now shattered by the full truth, found a way to navigate them with a new, weary understanding. My grandmother, in the wake of her grief and the revelation of her truth, found a quiet peace. She was a woman who had lived with a lie, but she was now a woman who understood the love that lay beneath it, a love that was complex and deeply flawed, but real. She and I, the two people who had known my grandfather's two great secrets, found a new kind of bond, a bond born of shared pain and a quiet, shared truth. We talked about his life, about the man who had loved two families in two different ways, and we learned to forgive him. The perfect family I had always known was a myth, a beautifully constructed fiction. But the true family, the messy, complicated, and deeply human family that remained, was something more beautiful. My grandfather's legacy wasn't the house, the money, or the flawless reputation. It was the messy, complicated truth that finally brought peace to two families. The secret was out, and our family, broken and beautiful, was finally ready to begin the long, difficult journey of healing, not as a perfect family, but as a real one. The final chapter of my grandfather's life was not a tragedy of betrayal, but a long, heartbreaking love story of a man who had to change his life to make it right, and a woman who had to live with the consequences.